Hi, everybody. I'm Mary Greendale, and this is Just Thinking. And picking up on my previous show about race, today I'm actually going to jump in it with both feet, and I'm going to talk to a former Hollistonian, a fellow who graduated from here. His name is Cecil Wright. And those of us who are really old will remember his father. And Cecil's father was a part of the highway department. And because he was Black in a very white town, maybe even whiter than today, we all knew him. He was obvious, but he was also a very cheerful fellow who was happy to talk to anybody. So today we have the pleasure of talking to his son, Cecil, who was in Nova Scotia, where I'd really love to be right about now. But anyway, so welcome, Cecil. I am so happy to meet you.
Well, it's a real pleasure, Mary. Thanks for having me.
No problem. So I got to your front door because you wrote an article that was posted on a New England Patriots page. And it was, apparently you have some loyal followers here in Holliston, some folks who maybe went to school with you or knew you growing up. And they notified me about the story and sent it to me or sent me the link. And I read it and was surprised about so many different pieces in it that I just really had to talk to you. So we're going to start right off the bat and say, you're from a Black community in Nova Scotia. And this was like, I didn't realize that Blacks had gone so far north, because you also sent a note to me and said you were right out of the slavery economy, the slave economy. Your family, your ancestors came from there. I didn't realize they'd gone so far north.
Well, fortunately, my ancestors were loyalists who fought on behalf of the British. The British promised freedom and land and opportunity in Canada if my ancestors decided to fight for them. So they, of course, wanted freedom, fought on behalf of the British, and ended up in Beachville, Nova Scotia, which is a small little tiny community outside Halifax, Nova Scotia, which is where I currently reside. My ancestors came up from the Chesapeake Bay area of Virginia. I know that much, and I really can't tell you too much more than that because, unfortunately, our history, my history, was never really taught in schools or institutions of higher learning. All we really were taught was about Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves, and good for Abe, but what about contributions that Blacks and other minorities made? I mean, look at the contribution from the Asian community as far as the railroads, and things like that weren't really taught in school, and that's one huge oversight that I think will go a long way to quell a lot of the racial unrest that we have right now.
That's a very good point. Now, you came to Holliston from where? From Roxbury? You ended up in Roxbury for a period of time, and then you moved from Roxbury, which is clearly a Black community, then and now, and you moved to Wonder Bread White. I mean, that's it. We're just, that's it. And so just briefly tell me the story you just told me before we went on air about your parents' problem finding housing.
Yeah, it's at first, I was kind of upset for my parents, but then as my mom said, the Lord sent a savior. My parents had gone to 3 or 4 different realtors after my father had been offered the job with the Holliston Highway Department by Roy Hulbert, and the guy who introduced them, by the way, passed away a few years ago, was on the board of selectmen named Loring Lovewell.
Yeah, a good friend of mine.
He's the man who's responsible for us coming to Holliston. So we owe his family a great debt of gratitude, as well as the Hulbert family, because Mr. Hulbert, Roy Hulbert, was the superintendent who hired Dad. But after that offer had been made, Mom and Dad had gone to about 3 or 4 different realtors in Holliston, and none of them would rent a small 2-bedroom home to them. And, they didn't want to think it was because they were Black, but in all honesty, that's the thing that they were thinking about. That was on, both their minds. So they're at the 4th realtor's office, and it was on Central Street in the same little strip mall that the pizza place was in. They thought they had a place in there because the agent was, very nice to them and seemed excited, to talk to them. And asked them what did they need. And, my parents told them, well, it's just three of us, us and our 6-year-old son, or I would have been 8 years old at that time. And the man said, I think I got just the place. He starts flipping through some pages in this little book with all kinds of pictures of homes. My parents now are getting excited because they didn't even get that far with the other ones. And then finally, the man my mother said was the owner of the agency came in and said, what's going on here? The agent said, well, this is Mr. and Mrs. Wright, and they need a small 2-bedroom, and I think we have one for them. And the owner said, it's taken. And the agent was like, no, it's not taken. It says right here, it's still open and available. And the owner said, no, I said it's taken. So my parents very dejectedly walked out of there, and, they're on the verge of tears, I'm sure. And, just standing, it was a hot day, it was in the summer. So they were just standing under this awning at one of the stores, in the shade, and, probably discussing their next move. And then this man just drives up and gets out of a truck, and, a black man, he sees my parents standing there. So he goes up and introduces himself, says, hey, who are you two? Never seen you here before. My name is Joe Gomes. Who are you? So my father introduces, he and his wife to this man, and, they start a conversation. Mr. Gomes is like, well, are you here visiting somebody or what? And Mom told him that, well, we're trying to rent a house, but nobody will rent to us. And Mr. Gomes is like, well, what kind of house do you need? And Mom said, well, just a small 2-bedroom, just enough for us and our son. And she said he got really excited. And he said, okay, give me a minute. I have to go into the store, but I'll be right back. Don't you move. Stay right there. So he goes in, comes back out and says, okay, follow me. And they followed him down the street on Woodland Street by what was the VFW. There's a driveway you could turn into. And they went down that road, and on the left was Mr. Gomes's house, but they kept on going. And on the edge of his property was a small 2-bedroom home. He said it hadn't been rented out. Nobody had been in there for over a year, but he said it has running water and electricity and heat, and whatever you need, you just let me know. But I'm going to let you in. You guys have a look around, then come up to the main house and see me, and we'll talk. And Mom said that my father, when Mr. Gomes left and went up to his house, my father said, do you think this guy's nuts? He's got to be crazy. I mean, who does this for people? And Mom said, I don't care. He can be nuts all he wants as long as he can provide us with a 2-bedroom house. And so they went in, looked around. Everything was cool. They went up and talked to Mr. Gomes, and no paperwork, no nothing, no down payment. He said, when do you need to be here? And it was like, August 1st. And he said, okay, you move in whenever you want to, and then we'll talk about money. That's how we came to end up in Holliston, thanks to Joe Gomes Sr. And if it wasn't for him, 5 minutes before he came over, or 5 minutes after, I don't know that we would have ended up in Holliston.
Amazing. And sadly, I can say I am aware of a woman of Jamaican, black, not African-American, but still black-skinned, who tried to move into Holliston a couple of years ago with a little girl. She had a Section 8 voucher, and nobody wanted to rent to her either. But eventually she found a good-hearted soul who did, and all is right with the world, at least in that venue. She got what she needed. But sadly, yeah. So you spent your high school here. You were a sports person. And Holliston loves sports. Holliston hasn't changed that way. There's something in the water, I guess. Holliston football team, the whole 9 yards. You were on the first Super Bowl team, was that right?
Well, no, I was, they didn't have the Super Bowl in my day. That's how old we are. But I was I played linebacker on defense for the Holliston High Panthers, I'm very proud to say. And I was a member of the very first undefeated team that Holliston had, the fall of '71, where we were undefeated state champs, led the state in scoring. We had just a fantastic team and got support from the entire town. And that's one thing that helped me, make it through some rather turbulent times in my life that I didn't really want to share with my friends, because I knew that incidents that I went through, if my friends knew about them, my friends were going to try to retaliate for them. And I didn't want anybody getting in any kind of problems, any trouble, because of what I was going through. So I internalized most of the incidents, and they were rare, that I went through, but still, for me, they were painful for me and my family because I couldn't hide anything from my mother. I could hide stuff from my father, but not from my mother. Like, she could just see right through me, and, you know, I called her the little general. She could just penetrate my soul and get me to say whatever it was that she wanted to hear. You know, she had that kind of mind control over me. I'm kind of thankful for, because I always had to be on the up and up with her, because I knew that she could tell if I was doing something wrong. She could just feel it. She knew.
So what was your experience like as I'm assuming the only Black child in Holliston schools at the time, and everybody else was pretty much white?
Yeah, there was, growing up in elementary school and in junior high, there was myself and one other guy who ended up getting in a car crash and getting killed in grade 9. And he and I, because we were in the same grade, we knew each other, but we weren't in the same class until later on, grade 6. So we weren't really close, but we were friends. He also was an athlete and very good too. And one thing is, I'll never forget this, like, some of the teachers tried to play me off against him. You know, like I was supposed to be the good guy, whereas he was always getting in trouble. And he wasn't doing anything, you know, violent to get in trouble. He just, if he was alive today, I think he would have been diagnosed with ADHD. He had trouble keeping still, you know, and he would always make little noises. You know, like I say, it was nothing malicious, but just enough to aggravate the teachers so that they'd kick him out of class, or he'd be sent to the principal's office, or he'd, you know, get a detention or something like that. And it used to really bother me when I would hear a teacher say, well, why can't you be more like Cecil? I didn't want him to be like me. I wanted him to be like him. And he wanted me to be like me. I mean, yeah, we were both Black, but we were two separate individuals who should not have been compared one against the other. Absolutely, that was wrong. But
That's an interesting, and it's subtle. I mean, it's not, you know, it's not subtle to you, but I'm sure in the mind of the teacher, it wasn't, to her it would be no different than probably comparing you to me or something else. She wasn't thinking that way, but
exactly, and that's the point I was going to get
problem.
to. She wasn't saying it to be rude or mean or anything like that. She was just trying to get control of her classroom, which I understood. However, the method that she used, in my opinion, just was not copacetic.
All right, gotcha. So you had incidents along the way where your skin color probably affected things. In general, were you accepted by the kids?
Listen, my childhood, my upbringing in Holliston, 99% of it was fantastic. I have such great memories of my time in that town. And not just as a child and an adolescent either. I mean, after I grew up a little bit, Holliston will always have a special part in my heart. But I did have a few, you know, little racial incidents, so to speak, starting with my very first day at school. Would have been going into my grade 4 year out on the playground. I'm the new guy, plus I'm the Black guy. So, you know, all the tough guys were lined up on the playground waiting for me after day 1. And in fact, the principal, who I shall remain nameless, you know, said to me after a couple of weeks, how come I keep seeing you in my office every day? What are you doing to get yourself in trouble? And I'm like, nothing. But all these other guys are out there, you know, ready to pick a fight with me. And he couldn't believe that, because, well, I've known all those guys for the past couple of years, and they're not the type of kids who would, you know, he was one of those guys. He was defending them. So I went home to my father, and I remember this conversation like it happened yesterday. And I said to him, I just want to let you know that I will not be returning to that school anymore. This was the Miller School, because these guys are just picking fights with me all the time. I'm sick and tired of fighting. And he said, you know, I can understand that, but I got just a thing that's going to fix that. And I'm like, what's going to fix that? He said, you're going to sign up for Little League Baseball. I'm like, nah, bad idea. You don't understand these guys. And he said to me, as soon as those guys see how you can throw that ball, they're all going to want you on their team, believe me. So I reluctantly went to Little League tryouts. And I, being from, or a Boston guy, a Roxbury guy, I wanted to play for the Red Sox. But I got selected to play for the Giants. So I was all upset about that. I ride my bike home. My father, he was waiting. He knew how smart he was. Man had a 6th grade education, but he had just an encyclopedia of knowledge. He knew better than to go to the tryout himself because it would put all kinds of pressure on me. So he stayed home and waited till I got home, asked me how it went. And I was like, didn't even get picked to play for the Red Sox. I get picked by the old stinky Giants. He goes, the Giants? Oh my God, they got the best player in the major leagues, Willie Mays. He's unbelievable. Wait till you see him. So he got me all excited to play for the Giants. And sure enough, all my teammates and friends now, everybody was bringing their glove with a ball so that we could play baseball at recess, and that stopped all my problems right there. He knew.
So the hard question is, what would the experience have been like without sports? What about the nerdy kid, the one who's really shy, the one who's got social issues that, doesn't fit in, or whatever issue? What happens then when you're Black?
Yeah, that's really tough, because there's enough pressure on a Black person who normally is the only, in his class or in his after school activity. It's hard enough just being a Black person, making it through all that. But when you don't have the benefit of having a whole bunch of teammates like I did, and you have to just fend for yourself, it's very, very difficult, not so much physically, but emotionally and mentally. You start to question yourself. And I don't know if there's anything worse a person can do to themselves than question motives or question whether they have the intuition that everybody is supposed to have. I'll tell you a quick story if I may.
Sure.
I was at a Boston Celtic game. I'm now about 17 or 18. And a group of friends and I went into the Garden to see the Celtics play. And it's now halftime comes, so a couple of us get up, we're going to go to the washroom, then we're going to get a Coke and a hot dog or whatever we're going to get in the concession line. And as I'm going by the line, it just started to form. So I'm going to go use the washroom, then come back and get in line. And as I'm going to the washroom, there was a young Black boy, he's probably about 12 or 13, in line, and there was a group of about 4 or 5 white teenagers that had him surrounded. And they were just messing with him, like, bumping him and trying to cut in front of him in line and, stuff like that. I'm absolutely enraged, but, I'm going to the washroom, hoping that when I come back, he'll have got what he needed and he's gone, everything's cool. I come back and the line has hardly moved at all, and he's still there and they're still harassing him. So I just reached up and grabbed him by the arm and said, here, come on with me. Went to the back of the line. We went up and we got our concessions together, and never said a word, this whole time, other than, here, come on with me. So we get our concessions, and I said, where are you sitting? And he just pointed, it wasn't too far from where we were. So I made sure I walked him back to his seat. And in the seat next to him was an elderly gentleman who had a cane, a Black man. I'm assuming it was his grandfather or an uncle or somebody of meaning to him. And when he got there, he just looked at me with tears in his eyes, and he said, thank you. That's all he said. And I was so angry at those teenage boys who were messing around with this guy. This kid's grandfather, could have been, a veteran. He obviously had some type of disability, so he sends up his young grandson to get concessions, and these guys are harassing him. And I mean physically harassing this young man. That to me is the type of young man who, as he grows up, has a bit of a stereotype against white teenagers or white boys and ends up hurting somebody. And people will say, well, see, he's just an angry young man, and, you can't reason with him, like that type of stuff. People don't know what other people have to go through to get to where they are. And I'd like to think that young man, I helped him out a little bit and maybe he would help out somebody else, you know, if he saw somebody in a similar situation.
Yes, that's a very poignant story. And I think you're right that it does point to something that can set a history or a path for somebody that's not going to turn out well. It's just not. And kids remember, even if you don't remember in your head, you remember in your heart and your soul, and something's wrong. And so you'll have a suspicion. I had the advantage of growing up in a mixed neighborhood, a black and white neighborhood. So it was just easy. It's how I was. Then as an older child, when I was 9, my family moved to a white bread village. And it was like complete, and then I ended up moving down here, and I actually missed it. I was once doing work in Pittsburgh, and I found myself in a huge auditorium, and I was maybe one of 5 whites, and I thought, I don't mind this. This feels fine to me, but I do notice it. And that made me wonder, but what if you don't feel fine? What if you're black and you're walking into an all-white room? What does this feel like? It's pretty overwhelming. It's pretty overwhelming to know you're being surrounded by others that don't look like you. And it must take a long time for you to, do you know that when you're 6 and you walk into the schoolroom? Do you notice, does it register? When you walk into a classroom, the first day you went to school here, as opposed to Roxbury, did you notice it?
I did, but it wasn't something that made an impression on me. Didn't matter to me, because I had one friend that I had met the night my parents came to Holliston to visit the superintendent, Mr. Hulbert. This one friend of mine named Skip was there, and he was playing with Mr. Hulbert's son. So I met Skip on my very first, 5 minutes in Holliston, and Skip and I were in that same grade 4 class, Miss Rooney's class, Nancy Rooney, great lady, God rest her. So I was somewhat comfortable with the fact that I knew somebody already who was in my same class. And Skip happened to be white, but, I didn't care about that. All I knew is he was my friend. We threw the ball together. But I've got to tell you another story, which is talking about what you just mentioned. In the work that I've done here in Halifax, I had the pleasure of being a chaperone on a Commonwealth Youth Exchange program, which took place in Trinidad and Tobago several years ago. So I was responsible for 6 Nova Scotians, 2 of whom were white females. Now, these 2 white females were the only 2 white people involved in this exchange. There are people from like all the islands, Grenada, Trinidad and Tobago, Barbados, Jamaica, St. Lucia, all the surrounding islands. So we went to this shopping mall on a Saturday. I'll never forget this either. And wherever I went, those 2 white females were right on my heels, and I remember them not leaving my side, but I, didn't think too much of it. So I had to use the washroom in this mall we're in. So I go into the washroom facility, and then I come out and I open the door. I almost hit one of them in the face with the door. That's how close they were to where I was. And I said to them, "What is wrong with you 2? What are you right on my heels for?" And this one girl says, "Well, we don't know if you noticed, but like we're the only white people in here." And I said, "Has anybody, approached you or, tried to do anything to you or anything?" And she said, "No, but it's just very uncomfortable." And I said, "Now you know how I feel every single day of my life back home. But you can't let that stop you from doing things and meeting people and attaining your goals." And they said, "Well, this is the only time we've ever been in this situation. We never looked at it like that because they never had to."
Wouldn't you love to know where they are today? Anyway, so I struggle a little bit. I mean, I'm having a very comfortable conversation with you because you're very approachable and we have something in common in terms of Holliston. But is it possible for whites to have conversations with blacks? Is it possible to engage the conversation about race in particular? Yes, you can talk about sports, or you can talk about the weather, but is it possible for whites? And what do we have to do as whites to have that conversation?
Well, that's a very good question. To me, the most important thing is you have to practice active listening. And by that, I mean, we both know people who, when you're engaged in a discussion or a dialogue with them, you can see that they're trying to formulate their response to what you're saying, rather than listening to what you're saying. And that's what I mean by active listening to try to understand what the person is saying, where they're coming from, trying to find out the reason why they feel the way they do. I mean, if you can start off doing that, then you can have those hard discussions. You can have those conversations that are going on right now about, Confederate statues being ripped down. I mean, who really cares about that? How's about talking about the historical contributions by, men and women of color, rather than guys who fought against the United States, people who are seen as traitors. To me, those are, some of the initial steps you have to take. But then, you have to take it a little step further and try to put yourself, I call it the how and why. Try to relate to how a person feels and try to understand why they feel the way they do. It might differ from your opinion, but you have to respect and try to understand why somebody would feel the way they do, particularly a person of color who's gone through incidents like that little boy at the Boston Garden. As I said earlier, you can't tell what a person has gone through to get them to where they are today.
No, none of us can. And in the 12-step program, and they say you can never judge another person's insides by their outsides, and it's so true. You don't really know. You jump to a lot of conclusions and bring a lot of baggage to it. So what do you think that the U.S., the whole, as a nation right now, I don't think we could get together to agree on having that bacon goes with eggs. I don't think we could agree on anything. But if there were to be one or two things that we could do as a nation, what should they be? What is the turning kind of, it feels like there's so many.
Yeah. Well, I would start with children and youth. I would try to incorporate a more historically accurate curriculum, particularly history. Like I said earlier, we never learned anything about, my ancestors other than they were slaves. And my ancestors were so much more than that. Dr. Christian Barnard, performed the first heart transplant. Do they teach that in school? Elijah McCoy, was an inventor who developed the first lubricator for train engines so that a train could go from point A to point B. And there are all kinds of other contributions, that Blacks have made that we don't have time necessarily to get into all of them. But if you teach, and I'm talking about the majority population, white people, if you teach white people that Black people too did some very, very positive things, maybe we wouldn't be seen as somebody other than a thug, or other than somebody who's looking for trouble, or somebody who's going to go to Chicago and start shooting up the neighborhood, and things like that. Yes, those things happen, but not all Blacks participate in those types of things. There are some Black people who do a lot of good things, particularly in the world of medicine, that we wouldn't be able to even be breathing if it wasn't for Garrett Morgan, for instance, who developed the gas mask. Now, how ironic is that, considering what's going on in Portland and Seattle right now?
Mm. Portland happens to be one of the bugaboos for me. It just is driving me absolutely crazy. I get into conversations about if this were Obama and it was about gun control and the protesters were pro-gun, would they want the feds to step in? No, they wouldn't, because that's the antithesis. They say they want guns so they can protect themselves if the government goes bonkers. Well, now you're sending in the feds with the guns. It doesn't make sense. So the hypocrisy of it, the convenience of being able to turn the story to be a different way, that freaks me out.
Well, the other thing when it comes to Obama is like, there are a lot of mostly white people who think, well, what did he do for race relations? Like, the man wasn't under enough pressure as it was, being the first Black president of the United States. Now, on top of that, you expect him to do the unachievable for the Black population simply because he's Black. I mean, do you expect Donald Trump to, be Johnny Great Guy for the entire white community simply because he's white? I don't think so. And if you do, then you got some biases, assumptions, and stereotypes of your own that you have to deal with.
Yeah, no, that's true. So the education system, and I agree with you wholeheartedly, the education system, is there something else that you would suggest to us at a level, you know, the national government, federal government? What else do you look at?
Well, I think that up to now, there really hasn't been a firm commitment to anti-Black racism. I think we talk about racism as a whole, as an entity inside of itself. But to me, you got to go even further than just the R word. You got to go with anti-Black racism, because that's really, when we're talking racism, that's what we're talking about. Although you're going to run into the odd person who says, well, you know, Black people, they're racist too, you know. And I always try to tell them, when I you know, run into somebody like that, I always try to tell them that, well, I can understand why you feel that way, but to me, it's an issue of power and control. And Black people don't have that power, nor do Black people have that control. So while you may want to call them racist, it's still anti-Black racist principles that we're dealing with. And those types of policy issues must be legislated, I believe, in order to really make the difference that you and I hope to see before we die. And I don't know that we're going to live long enough to see it.
Oh, gee. That's a pretty grim thought. Thanks.
You told me I could be honest.
Yeah, no, it's funny because I do sometimes think about that. I do wonder, you know, will I be around to see that this finally has a real step forward? I mean, each time I think we've taken a step forward, I know everybody promoted things like affirmative action. In the long run, it was almost self-defeating. It continued to make them, whoever was participating, separate. It continued to make them they became targets of, oh yeah, you got that. So I guess that makes up for everything else that happened to your ancestors or anybody else. We haven't gotten it right yet.
I think that the intention of affirmative action was good.
Yeah.
I think the way it was rolled out, though, made the white community very, very resentful of what was going on, because it led to the impression that qualified whites were not receiving jobs because they were being taken by unqualified Blacks. I think that's the effect that it has had. And I think that's unfortunate, because there are a lot of Black people who have benefited by that practice. It was the only way that they would even get the opportunity to be interviewed for certain positions. But it makes it look like it's a position of tokenism, quite honestly.
Yeah.
I don't know that that was entirely the case, but I know that that's how some white people feel.
Yeah, I've heard that for sure. So here we are in humble little Holliston. So how do I get a conversation about race going? I think you're doing a great job helping me out today. We're going to use this, and I talked yesterday with a few women who have been part of a diversity group. They're all white, although there are members of the group that are not. The Black woman is the co-conspirator, if you will, the co-founder. But those are small steps. My goal, obviously, the schools. I know we have a new interim superintendent, and she apparently is very much into refining and redefining the education curriculum so that it does, in fact, bring history to life in the real way, using the real terms, using the real experiences. You know, that would get us to all of the things with the GI Bill and the Blacks that, you know, fought in the war and didn't get the same benefits and blah-de-da. So I think she's going to be an ally. But how do I get a broader conversation so that everybody becomes a little bit more sensitive to the fact that we as whites just have a very different perspective? What do I have to say to get? Maybe I can't. You can tell me I can't. You can tell me I'm just being dumb thinking I can do this. But what do I do?
Well, I think it starts with the whole issue of inclusion and diversity. You know, I'm glad to hear that you've got a diversity committee. That's impressive as a start. But I think you can go even further when it comes to education. You know, does the staff at the schools, do the teachers, do they take any inclusion or diversity training? Is that provided? Do they have professional days where the teacher can go to a workshop and maybe enhance their understanding of those types of issues. I mean, I don't know how many Black students are currently enrolled in Holliston schools, but I'm certain that it's more than was there when, back in the 60s and 70s. So there are going to be a lot of students who are growing up that shouldn't have to hear the following statement that I heard from a guidance counselor. Well, you're going to be a big, strong man. Are you going to be a laborer when you grow up? Is that what you want to be? I was like, well, no, not. I don't want to be a laborer. I'm thinking about maybe going into teaching because I never saw anybody like me as a teacher in school, although that's a lie. There was a Mrs. Jackson, was an elementary school teacher back in my day. She was the only Black teacher in the school, and nobody messed around with her either, let me tell you.
She lived across the street from me. Yeah, she and her husband. In fact, Stan convinced me to go into become an Amway saleswoman with him. I was part of his pyramid. At any rate, you just said something that made me think I had a quick question about. Oh, it's gone now, but anyway. All right. Well, I think that everything that you have said folds into very well with what the women were talking about yesterday in terms of the kinds of things we need to be doing. And I think this is a really good beginning, and I feel very comfortable being able to, put this out there, and let's see if we can have a conversation. I don't expect it to be, the whole town getting together, but rather small groups of people maybe just start talking about it. What we have here is I don't honestly know how many Black kids there are, if we're talking African American. We do have about 50 to 55 students that have English as a second language. So we have a big population of folks from Pakistan, and I have talked to them, and their experiences are a little different from what you've described for yourself. Then we have a population of Egyptians. Well, I don't know how that experience is. I mean, I need to have some conversations, but you've pointed out that we've got two different things there. There can be race relations that are not Black specific, Black being African American slave base, as opposed to all other races or any other race or any other difference. I mean, I find that there are, kids that are autistic are separated or isolated in their own ways, or kids that are, physically disabled, they have their own issues. And then there are always those kids that just don't fit in, period. That whole thing, but you've helped me to separate as one from the other.
I grew up as a person who was involved not just in sports. I was involved with the chorus, with the band, with student government. My senior year, I was co-president of the student council, which in those days, I mean, that's really saying
that's
something.
Huge.
Yeah, considering the fact that there was 2 Blacks in my graduating class. And that's something till the day my parents died, they were more proud of the fact that I was involved in student government than for anything I had done athletically or musically. The fact that in their eyes, I could be perceived as a leader meant more to them than anything other than me getting good grades. And my father, by the way, since you knew him, let me tell you something about him. When my father realized that sports and athletics I had made a connection with, he weaponized it against me. He said, I'll take you right off that football team if your grades aren't 80 or above, and he would have done it. So I tried to keep my average around 83 to 85, just, for a little slippage in case I screwed up every now and then. But he meant it. And he knew that because he only had a grade 6 education, my education was far more important to him than it was to me.
Right.
I mean, I hate to say that, but it's the honest to God's truth.
Yep.
First thing he would ask when he got home, how was school today? And I remember I lied to him one time. I had a good day. Oh, really? Well, I ran into Mr. Kerboy down at the restaurant, and he told me, and I'd be like, oh, man.
Yeah.
What I forget is because he worked for the highway department,
He knew everybody.
He was likely to be anywhere at any time, and whoever it was he was talking to probably knew that he was my dad and blah, blah, blah. I couldn't get away from it. So I learned I will be telling this man the truth from now on.
Well, I'll tell you, one thing hasn't changed. News still spreads the same way. You can go to Superette and find out you go down for lunch and you find out your kid got detention in second period. Anyway.
I used to love their roast beef sandwiches.
Yeah, they're still there. They're still there, the roast beef and the folks. So, hey, Cecil, this has been great. You've been fun and you've been very, very helpful. I appreciate that because, yeah, I appreciate that. I'd like to be able to call you back sometime if you don't mind.
I would be delighted, and allow me to say hello to all my friends in Holliston, the Shanahans and the Paquettes and the Jarvis, man. The Jarvis are now Carol Powell.
Yeah.
They lived on Mapledale Lane. I spent more time there than I did at my own house and would have never been able to survive without them. So I thank all my friends from Holliston for helping to get me to this point in life.
Oh, that's great. And I wish you the best. I wish you good health. Stay healthy with all of this COVID nonsense. But at any rate, thank you very much again.
My pleasure. You as well. Take care.
Okay, take care. Okay, folks, that's it. I'll be back again with another, I don't know. I'll be thinking about something. So I'll be back soon. Take care.